Hi, this is Kirby Anderson. Each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, your guest host for Point of View.
Welcome to Point of View. It's the weekend edition, and I am your host today, Liberty McArtor, sitting in for Kirby Anderson, and I am surrounded by some excellent co-hosts. Over here to my left, I have Peyton Luke, media specialist at First Liberty Institute and the producer and often guest host of First Liberty Live. So, Peyton, welcome back to the studio.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me, Liberty.
And also in studio with us from First Liberty is Nathan Shackelford, Associate General Counsel for First Liberty and leader of their F3 initiative. If you listen to Point of View throughout the week, then you will have heard Nathan a couple of days ago. He was here in studio with Kirby talking more about the F3 initiative. Nathan, it's great to have you back.
Yeah, great to be back.
So we have a busy show today, lots of important topics to cover. So just a little rundown. And by the way, don't forget, you can follow along with everything that we're discussing today at pointofview.net and find the articles that we're referencing, and I encourage you to do that. But here in just a few minutes, we're going to dive into some cases. We always like to highlight what's going on at First Liberty, and both Peyton and Nathan will give us some updates. And especially if you are a parent of kids in grade school or college, or a grandparent, or maybe you're a student yourself, I think you're really going to be wanting to know what's going on with these cases. And then we'll broaden the conversation and talk about education, but specifically what President-elect Trump has promised to do in his administration, and we'll look at some of the potential there and the pros and cons of some of those potential changes to education in America. And then in the next hour, you'll want to stay with us because we'll be discussing Penna Dexter's commentary on the backlash to the mainstream media and some of the ramifications that that's having in culture and how we can respond as Christians. So it's going to be a great show, but let's dive right in. Nathan, the other day, I think you briefly mentioned this case with Kirby, but let's go ahead and talk about it again. There was, if I'm understanding correctly, a fifth grade boy in California who was made to participate in an activity in class that violated his beliefs as a Christian. And his parents asked if they could opt out of this kind of activity, and they were told no, they can't. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. We're in Southern California, so one of the better parts of California, San Diego area. And fifth grade boy goes to class. He's told he needs to read this book called My Shadow is Pink, which is about a boy that feels like a girl on the inside. So pushing LGBTQ, transgender mentality. And the parents said, hey, we're Christian people. This goes against what we believe. We want to opt our kids out of this book. And so doesn't just stop there, though, when they're denied that. He was also, during that time, had to ask his kindergarten buddy what color he wanted his shadow to be and then draw the shadow. So actually not just read the book, but participate. And so there's actually really good law in California on you can opt out for sex ed. Mm-hmm. So you would generally think, okay, well, if you can opt out for sex ed, you can opt out for this. But the school is saying, no, it's not sex ed. It's a cultural, or it's some kind of other issue that falls outside of sex ed. So they said no, and then they instituted a Pink Out the Hate Day to encourage all the other kids to wear pink, essentially to alienate the kid, isolate the kid. So, and that came out of that was something that came from a home event that we were doing for our F3 initiative. So just a parent that said, when we were talking about this, she said, I never thought this would happen to me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think that goes to show, again, just how important it is to have those conversations and the great work that you are able to do with the F3 initiative of connecting with people, because I wonder if there are a lot of parents out there or students who don't realize all the rights that they do have as people of faith in the public school system.
Yeah, I mean, you see it all over the place, because really, if you're a parent and, if you have a fifth grade daughter in Seattle and she wants to start a prayer club, and then the school says no prayer club, but we can have all these other clubs. A lot of times as a parent in that situation, your options are, we're taking out loans or depleting all of our savings to hire a hugely expensive attorney, or we just give up. And so a lot of people don't know, okay, well, there's other options. I can actually stand up for my faith, and I can actually have people that represent me for free. So when people can not only know what their rights are, but then know there are people that can help them, it can help people to take a stand, make sure we don't lose rights. Because if we just let this, what happened in Encinitas happen, and let what happened what happens all over the country with school clubs, prayer clubs, if we just say, well, it's okay if we lose those, then eventually we'll just lose them all across the country. So we have to be able to stand up to those.
Absolutely. And Peyton, it's heartbreaking to me what Nathan referenced, that the school not only said no to a reasonable request, but then they retaliated. And I was reading on firstliberty.org that there was actually so much bullying against this family after that they had to move. They had to switch schools. And I think that is unfortunately an accurate picture of what's happening in a lot of places around the country right now.
Yeah, sure. It was such an unfortunate situation, and I just can't believe that they were already teaching this material to kids of this age, and then already involving a kindergartner by, working with the elementary school student and asking that kindergartner, hey, what color do you want your shadow to be, when they had their project. And it was just so unfortunate. And I know our particular client, he felt just so uncomfortable with the entire situation. So no child should be forced to speak a message that violates their religious convictions, and the parents should know what their kids are learning in school and have the option to opt out. So we hope the district ends its unclearly unlawful behavior and protects the religious liberty of every student by granting our clients the ability to opt their children out.
Absolutely. So again, this is something that unfortunately people are dealing with. Nathan, I know you mentioned you talk with a lot of young parents. And, this is something that Point of View has highlighted, that there are these, sometimes extreme ideologies or very political agendas that are being introduced in the classroom in very young grades. And it's not happening in every single school district. And so some parents may think, well, I don't really think it's as big of a problem. But I was just talking to someone the other day that they moved here to Texas, and they had been in another state where they were surprised when this same kind of curriculum was being taught to their kindergartner. And I think it's kind of like you said, they never thought that this would happen to me, or that I would be confronted with this choice. But I think this is probably why a lot of parents are losing faith in public education.
Yeah, there's a good quote by Justice Roberts that says, you can't fight for your rights if you don't know what they are. And I think when we're talking about kids, a lot of the kids don't. You're in school to kind of learn, kind of get the start on life, to kind of figure out how you're going to shape your worldview, how you're supposed to interact with people. You're learning so much, and it's really on the parents to kind of know what's right and wrong. The kid's isn't going to know what's right and wrong. They're just being taught. They're being taught essentially what's right and wrong. So the parents, if we see education shifting one way, the parents have to be the ones that are educated to say, no, my kids aren't going to be a part of this, or no, you're doing this in a way that I don't want my kids to be in. And so I think a lot of it starts with parents having to be involved, watching what's going on, having conversation with their kids, and really knowing what their rights are to make sure their kids aren't put in these types of situations. Yes,
good point, because as parents, we are the ones ultimately in charge of our kids' education. And I think that a lot of times in our nation and in different school systems, we lose sight of that, but it is our job to be, the overseers of that education and partner with other schools. But we have another education-related case to talk about right after this break. So stay with us, and don't forget, you can follow along with our topics at pointofview.net. We'll be right back after this short break.
This is Viewpoints with Kirby Anderson.
Ned Ryan begins his article with these questions. What if I told you that the President of the United States doesn't really run our government, or that people in Washington, D.C. don't really believe in representative democracy, or that a government of, by, and for the people is just an illusion? His article and his book, American Leviathan, The Birth of an Administrative State and Progressive Authoritarianism, explains that we have moved from a republic to an un-American administrative state. He calls it a slow regime change or a gradual coup that is undermining our Constitution and our constitutional republic. It has undercut the original intent of the Constitution. It has eroded our freedoms. It has undermined our civil liberties. Back to his original questions, the administrative state calls into question who is governing our country. We have seen this in the last few years of the Biden administration. So many of us wondered who was making the important decisions, since it seemed obvious to most of us that the president wasn't up to the task mentally. Ned Ryan provides the history that goes back to the progressive movement led by Woodrow Wilson. The goal was to build a massive bureaucracy filled with unelected bureaucrats who were separated from political accountability. These elites would govern our country. They rejected the idea of a rights-based government because it was too limited in size and scope. That is why we have a sprawling federal bureaucracy. He argues that the president and Congress needs to break apart the administrative state and return legislative powers back to the Article I branch of government. To put it simply, it is time to drain the swamp. If this happens, we need more than slogans, we need action. I'm Kirby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free booklet on biblical reliability, go to viewpoints.info/biblical reliability. Viewpoints.info/biblical reliability. You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Welcome back to the Weekend Edition. I'm Liberty McArtor, sitting in today for Kirby Anderson, and I am with, in studio, Peyton Luke and Nathan Shackelford, both from First Liberty Institute. We were just talking about a case involving a fifth grade boy in California who was told that he could not have an exemption from a class activity that violated his religious beliefs. And so thankfully you guys are on that case and you are standing up for the rights of that young man and families everywhere. But in terms of higher education, there is another situation going on at First Liberty. So you guys just announced this week in your press release that you filed an appeal to the U.S. Supreme Court on behalf of Bethesda University. And this has to do with the rights of religious institutions to be able to operate in accordance with their religious beliefs. So Peyton, tell us about that case.
Sure. So this has to do with church autonomy, or as the attorneys like to call it, ecclesiastical abstention.
Okay.
But anyway, yeah, and I'll get into the details of what exactly that means. But essentially, we filed a cert petition at the United States Supreme Court, which means we are asking SCOTUS to hear the case. They have not accepted yet, but we have sent in our request. So Bethesda University is a Korean-American Pentecostal institution located in California. Here's another case in California
again. All right.
Yep. It was forced to include board members that were not in the same denomination, and the courts got involved. So this is kind of a government interference situation. Gotcha. So here's what happened, essentially. The university's president wanted individuals who do not share those religious beliefs to be on the board. The rest of the board objected. The full rest of the board objected. And essentially they let the president go, and then the rival board faction filed a lawsuit. Then the California courts got involved, and it essentially held that the Pentecostal organization's foundational documents must permit others to occupy some of the highest leadership positions, even if they don't share the university's religious commitments.
Wow.
So this is really rough. So why does this matter to some of our listeners or the everyday American? Well, essentially, if this is allowed to stand, it sets a bad precedent, which means that it could impact other churches or religious institutions, Christian universities, other religious universities down the road. So that's why it is so very important. And I do want to quote Jeremy Dice, who's our senior counsel on this particular case. And he says, how religious organizations choose to operate is a sacred right protected by the First Amendment. Secular courts are not competent to evaluate the religious character of religious organizations. The U.S. Supreme Court has made it clear that the Constitution protects the independence of the religious organizations to choose their own leaders, and we ask it to do so once again in this particular case. And if you look at some other law, and even stated in our petition, we were quoting Jones v. Wolf from 1979, and it says the First Amendment prohibits civil courts from resolving disputes on the basis of religious doctrine and practice. So essentially, the courts, based on past precedent, have been allowed to get involved if there is a dispute based on property, but they're not supposed to be getting involved if it's with religious doctrine. So as Jeremy has mentioned before, the California court should have looked at this, and they should have been like, this is outside of our jurisdiction. This is beyond what we need to get involved with. They should have dismissed the case. But no, here we are. And so we are appealing to the Supreme Court.
It's ironic to me, and maybe this shows a lack of understanding of the First Amendment, but in some cases you have the government saying you can't be involved in government in any way, in any sort of position or capacity if you are expressing faith. And then here, this is a very clear example of government getting involved in a private, religious organization, which, again, it seems common sense that it's unconstitutional. But again, I'm glad that we're highlighting this because I imagine there might be fear just in today's cultural climate for certain faith-based institutions like smaller schools or nonprofit groups who worry that are they going to get in trouble? Are they going to get forced to hire people in influential leadership positions that don't align with them theologically? But any sort of faith-based group is formed typically to in some way perpetuate that faith and those beliefs, whether it's a school or a nonprofit group. And so if they can't hire people who espouse those beliefs that they're trying to advance, what's the point of even having religious institutions?
Yeah, if you look at the founding of our country, if you look at the First Amendment, how it breaks down, there's under the religion clause, there's free exercise and establishment clause. And what the establishment clause says is we don't want there to be a nationally established religion. And that's kind of what you have here is the idea of we don't want government getting entangled with what churches are doing. So we don't want the government to be the one determining what is and is not religious, which is why if you look all throughout our protections, like in filing religious accommodations, it's very broad on what's defined as religious because we don't want the government saying we consider this religious but not this religious. And so it's the same thing here of if the government is allowed to dictate what happens in a religious university, what happens when you have a dispute inside of a church? We don't want the government to be able to come inside of a church and start telling the church you have to allow this deacon to sit on your to serve in your church, or you need to have your board of elders be open, because then at that point now we're just destroying all religious institutions, which was totally the opposite of what our founders intended.
Absolutely. So Peyton, I know that this is something that is close to your heart because you have worked in specifically a religious college office in the past. So I bet you can really vividly imagine what it would have been like if the government had been involved in the everyday affairs of a Christian university.
Yeah, for sure. Growing up, my dad was on church boards, and then my first job out of college was actually working at my alma mater in the president's office. And so I worked with the president's cabinet. I worked with the board members. I was in a lot of those meetings. I saw a lot of the coordination of the administration around it and those relationships and the decisions that were made. And I can just imagine the stresses and all the conflict that would happen internally and not being able to get to a resolution on certain decisions for the good of the university if you had opposing viewpoints and if they weren't aligned on their religious doctrine, because that is the heart of the university and a lot of these religious universities. So in this case, the very identity of Bethesda University is at stake, and that is why we are asking the Supreme Court to intervene and take this case.
Okay. Well, and then I know that you don't know for sure on these things, but do you have a rough timeline of when you might know whether this case is actually going to be heard by the Supreme Court?
It takes time. I mean, we won't hear this year. There's certain windows where they kind of look at cases. They're generally off in summertime. So I don't know if there's a set time or not, but it definitely won't be this year.
Something to follow.
Yeah,
something to follow
absolutely.
for sure. So we've discussed for parents or for students, some of the rights that they have in public schools. We were talking about religious institutions, including universities, churches. So if somebody is saying, I wonder if that applies to me or what exactly that means for my situation or my group, First Liberty actually has some resources that are free and available for people to take advantage of to learn what their rights are in specific situations. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. We have what we call protection kits on our website under the resources tab, and it breaks out to every topic you could think of that this could come up, from private schools to public schools to people in the workplace, churches, nonprofits, all kinds of different topics that people could think, what happens to what are my rights for my faith in this space? And so if you want to get those, you can go to firstliberty.org and then go to the resources tab, and we have those all there for download that you can download for free.
That is such a great resource. I definitely encourage you, if you're listening, to check that out, firstliberty.org. And of course, you can find that link at pointofview.net as well. So if you're just joining us, I'm Liberty McArtor sitting in for Kirby Anderson today on the weekend edition. And we have, as we always like to do on Fridays, been discussing some important updates on religious liberty, some cases that First Liberty Institute is handling. And so you can read more about those by going to pointofview.net and reading the articles that we have posted for free there. I'm also going to encourage you to follow us on social media. We're on Facebook, we're on Twitter, or X, as I should say now. And so definitely follow us there. And if you are listening and you are thinking, wow, I have missed the last couple of days of Point of View, I want to catch up, there's something called Point of View Highlights on Spotify put together by our audio engineer, Megan. So definitely go to Spotify, subscribe to Point of View Highlights so you can stay up to date on all the topics we cover. But we'll be right back with more after this short break.
The Bible tells us not to worry. And yet, there is a lot of worrying stuff in our world today. Thankfully, the Bible doesn't stop at telling us not to worry. God gives us a next step. He says we need to pray. But sometimes, even knowing what to pray can be difficult. And that is why Point of View has relaunched our Pray for America movement, a series of weekly emails to guide you in prayer for our nation. Each week, you'll receive a brief update about a current issue affecting Americans, along with a written prayer that you can easily share with others. We'll also include a short free resource for you in each email so you can learn more about the issue at hand. Will you commit to pray for America? Go to pointofview.net. Click on the Pray for America banner at the top of the page to subscribe. Again, that's pointofview.net. Click on the Pray for America banner. Let's pray together for God to make a difference in America. Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, your guest host for Point of View.
Welcome back to the weekend edition. We are talking about education. We've been discussing some First Liberty cases that had to do with education, both in the grade school level and at the university level. But let's talk about some things that might change with regard to education. We've got a new presidential administration that will be taking office in January. And how will that affect education? So if you go to pointofview.net, one of the articles we have listed there is from the Wall Street Journal. It is all about President-elect Trump's plans for how he is going to tackle multiple education issues. So over the next few minutes, we'll talk about what some of those are, our thoughts, pros and cons, whether or not they're likely to happen. But just an overview, some of the things mentioned in that Wall Street Journal article. Trump has talked about eliminating the Department of Education, likely to be a very controversial take, already is both sides of the aisle. But I think that a lot of people could agree. There have definitely been some issues with the Department of Education, so we'll see whether or not that actually gets eliminated. That's going to be a difficult process if he does want to go through with that. He's talked about tackling the left-wing ideology that's permeating so many universities and even grade schools like we've been talking about. You have examples like we just spoke about earlier on the show, the case in California with in fifth grade, a child was not able to opt out of a very progressive gender ideology lesson because of his religious faith. So you're having more and more families deal with things like that. I've talked to parents who have left public school or moved to a different district because of those kinds of issues. Also, you have the issue of sports and students who identify as transgender playing on whichever sports team they choose and using whichever bathroom and locker room they choose. I think this was an issue that resonated with a lot of parents leading up to the election, which we've discussed on Point of View, but I think that is something that has concerned a lot of parents, especially when you get up to the high school level, and there are a lot of differences between male players and female players, and concerns over fair competition. We do have the change that happened in the Biden administration so that sex discrimination includes gender identification, which again is something that a lot of people have a problem with because they feel like it erases rights for girls in school as it was supposed to originally protect. And then just other changes too. He's talked about universal school choice. So Nathan, I wanted to turn it to you because you're a parent yourself. So you might be thinking about education at the grade school level before too long. I'm a parent of two young ones and we homeschool. So and you also work with through F3 initiative with First Liberty, a lot of parents of young kids. So what are your thoughts on some of these issues that Trump wants to address? What do you think might resonate most?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the biggest issues that we've seen in the education system is teaching kids what to think instead of how to think. A lot of times it's just, we want you to know these things for standardized tests, but then we want you to almost want kids to be just empty vessels that we can fill with whatever agenda we want to push versus teaching students how actually to process, to think through things. I mean, you can see that if you look at some of the classes that a lot of kids take, they don't take history a lot of times until they're a lot older. And then when they're doing history, a lot of the focus is on memorize this date for the test. You need to know that in 1870, whatever. But you don't see debate. You don't see, let's take an issue and talk about both sides of it. It would be like teaching that 2 + 2 is 4, but not teaching how to get the addition. Mm-hmm. So I think a lot of parents just want their kids to know how to think versus what to think. And so when we talked about that school choice type issue, and a lot of how our society works is if we don't like something, we have the free market system to be able to say, well, if this isn't working for me, I'm going to do something else. But in the education system, if you don't have a school choice program, those dollars follow your kids. So if you put your kid in a private school, you're paying for the education of that public school, but you're also paying for the private school at the same time. So if we have these school choice programs that come in, that'll really allow parents to kind of choose where they educate their child. And we've seen that play out in different places, even in liberal California, where they have a really good charter system that will allow homeschool families to actually have these homeschool co-ops and use state funding for that. Of course, then they've then tried to twist it where you can't use religious curriculum. So we have a lawsuit in California for that. But there are these signs that people really want to have more of a say in the education of their child, so that they can just be good citizens, know how to think instead of just knowing facts for a test.
So good. Yes. That is definitely one of the biggest issues that I've seen. I taught for a few years as well in a small Christian school, but a lot of those students were leaving the previous context of the public school. And I think that is just an aspect and a purpose of education that has been lost. But I just want to mention, I know a lot of times people talk about, so many people are leaving public schools, but since the pandemic began, public schools have lost about 1 million students, which is huge. And a lot of that is due to, what they saw during the pandemic, the lack of choice, the lack of school choice, the kind of progressive ideologies that they are seeing taught in schools. But a new issue is popping up I did want to highlight briefly. It's not on the website at Point of View, but you can look up the Free Press. And they published a lengthy investigative report by the author and journalist Abigail Schreier. And it is called The Kindergarten Intifada, which basically she says there is a well-coordinated national effort between teachers, activist organizations, and administrators to indoctrinate American children against Israel. And she raises our attention to the fact that this is kind of the new ideology that is sweeping, and you might think, well, surely not everywhere, but there are so many examples. If you look up the article on Jewish kids being just horribly bullied in schools, of actually, these very anti-Israel curriculums being taught. So anyways, I do encourage listeners to look it up, but I don't really think it's a surprise that more and more parents are growing leery of public education and probably would welcome some of these changes. What do you think, Peyton?
Yeah, and I think with COVID, people realized how fragile our system is and started to take back the control and the ownership for themselves and their own family. And to mention the Free Press article like you did, there is a video that is embedded in that article, and it's people talking at the United Teachers Los Angeles meeting. And literally the guy that is talking says how to be a teacher and an organizer and not get fired. Like, they're teaching the teachers how to organize for pro-Hamas and pro-Palestine, and intentionally indoctrinating against Israel, like you said. And it's so interesting because as someone who's in communication and PR, it is fascinating to me how Hamas and the people in charge of their messages are able to twist a message and manipulate and gaslight to where suddenly they seem like the victims when they were the ones that started in October 7th and other things. So it's just so interesting how they're able to take and twist those situations. But yeah, it's interesting all the different things that Trump is now going to get into office and proposing to do. He'll need Congress's help on this. Just because he got elected does not mean he'll be able to initiate it on his own. He will need Congress's assistance.
Yes, good point. And we do know now, as of this week, that he not only has a Republican majority in the Senate, but also officially in the House of Representatives as well. So we'll see how that affects some of the education reforms that he's proposing. But yes, I wanted to just make a connection really quick with another thing that was mentioned in that Free Press article. Kirby has talked a lot about critical theory, and we hear about critical race theory specifically as one of the things that parents have a problem with being taught in schools, but it's actually just one branch of a broader ideology that's rooted in Marxism, but it's a way of looking at the world. It's a worldview of its own where everything is viewed as oppressed versus oppressor. And if you are the oppressor, then you are automatically bad. If you are the oppressed, you are automatically good. And so it is gives a very rigid way of looking at the world. But another image that was in that Free Press investigative report showed part of a curriculum that was being taught in elementary school, where it literally lists Israel as the oppressor and other nations as the oppressed, saying that anytime you have a group that is oppressing another group, they are automatically bad. Of course, there are oppressors and oppressed in life, but the Bible tells us that that's not really the lens that we should be looking at things through. It's a lot more complicated in life. There's a lot more nuance, but this is just another example of, like you said, Peyton, yes, we are, there is a distinct effort to manipulate public opinion regarding a whole host of issues, including about Israel, starting at the very youngest in our society. So this is something I wanted to raise your attention to, but we're about to come to one of those breaks. We will talk a little bit more about some of the K through 12 changes in education we might see, but also talk about some ways that Trump wants to reform colleges and universities. So stay tuned. We'll be right back after these short messages.
It's been a long time since conservatives expected fair and balanced coverage of elections by the legacy media. But the left counts on traditional news outlets to tip the scales with favorable coverage of its candidates and issues. True to form, major outlets like the New York Times, the Washington Post, CNN, NBC, ABC, and CBS covered the 2024 campaigns and handled debates and interviews in the biased way they always do. But in this election, the media's failure to provide truthful and fair coverage hurt the left. Wall Street Journal columnist Kimberly Strassel writes, "So long as the left is pointing fingers, let it direct a big fat digit at the outfit that played the biggest role in losing at the election, the U.S. media. We cannot place the media in one overarching category. The Journal itself is legacy media, but its editorial page skews right. Today, Americans have numerous media outlets to choose from, and so do candidates. Even the Washington Post points out that Trump and his surrogates saw incredible value in tapping into a podcast ecosystem that has large numbers of young male listeners who otherwise might have skipped casting ballots. Meanwhile, much of the media ignored and expected voters to ignore border chaos, higher prices, and especially President Biden's decline. As Kim Strassel points out, in a world with a competent press, Mr. Biden's failing constitution would have been front-page news. Instead, the legacy media cooperated with the Democrats in covering it up. If they had done a better job reporting on it, there would have been time to hold a primary, which would have produced a tested nominee. Big shock, Americans didn't buy narratives like, we're experiencing one of the strongest economies ever, or crime is falling. First Amendment freedoms include the press, because the press is meant to provide politicians with gut checks as to how their policies sit with the nation. Traditional news outlets face a reckoning. For Point of View, I'm Penna Dexter.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Welcome back to the weekend edition on Point of View. I'm Liberty McArtor sitting in for Kirby Anderson today, and we have been having a great discussion on education with Peyton Luke and Nathan Shackelford from First Liberty Institute. So we were just talking about a Wall Street Journal article that you can read going to pointofview.net, talking about some of the proposed changes that President-elect Donald Trump is wanting to make when he takes office in January. One of those is dismantling the Department of Education. Peyton, that seems like a kind of big task. What are your thoughts on that?
It is a big task. And like I said right before the break, Trump can't do this alone. Just because he was elected president doesn't mean that it will automatically happen. He needs Congress's assistance to pass this and make this happen. But I did want to mention, I have a lot of friends that are teachers, and I see both sides. I spent last night doing some research on this topic, and I got into the endless scroll of comments regarding this topic and seeing all kinds of things that people were saying. So I know some of the conversations around the programming and the funding that goes to students with disabilities. I know other conversations around like, okay, giving power to the states, but people were concerned because they weren't seeing a clear plan. But ultimately, I think it's interesting because, you know, even if he removes this agency, it doesn't mean they're going to remove the issues that it addresses. It's more about finding a better, more effective solution. So it will be interesting as the days move forward, seeing how Trump lays out that plan.
Those are good points. And yes, I do just want to give a respect and a shout out to the teachers out there because, look, it's not an easy job. Like I said, I've, taught for a brief stint and not in as big of classrooms as most people who are working in public education have to deal with. And so the teachers are doing the real work out there and working oftentimes making the best of the environment that they're in and trying to help kids in the best way that they can. And I do think that this is kind of common for Trump is to make big sweeping promises that are usually rooted in some real issue. But I think it's always important to try to not simply be reactionary. We can react to problems, but as Peyton said, in a targeted or well thought out manner so that we're not creating more problems trying to address real problems that already exist. We'll see whether or not that, kind of careful approach is taken in the next administration or not. It'll be lots to discuss for sure. But I did want to circle back to the universal school choice issue, because if that becomes a reality for people in every state where they can choose where to send their child to school, then there is actually a Supreme Court precedent that's going to support their rights in that.
Yeah, absolutely. So First Liberty had a case a few years ago called Carson v. Macon that dealt with that issue where Maine is so rural in many areas that over half of their school districts don't have a public school in that school district. So if you want to send your kid to school, you may not have a place to send them.
Wow.
They put in this voucher system. You can send them anywhere you wanted, including across the border, all boys schools, all girls schools, whatever. And then a few years into it, put in a stipulation that said, but you can't send them to a religiously affiliated school because that'd be a government endorsement of religion. We sued saying that's just religious discrimination because all you're doing is you're comparing a private school to a Christian school. If they hit the same accreditation, if they're teaching the same, the standards or whatever, and they just have one has a class in religion, one doesn't. All you're doing is you're singling out that religious school. And so the Supreme Court agreed 6-3 and they said clearly we're not making this universal, saying now there's universal school choice, but when you have that school choice program moving forward, you cannot discriminate against religiously affiliated schools moving forward. And so that doesn't mean that, I know a lot of people would be hesitant here to say, well, if I want this type of program to happen, that means that there'd be strings attached. Like they could tell the school, you have to teach a transgender lesson or something like that, or not be accredited. But I think the Supreme Court has made it pretty clear that they want it to be with no strings attached, that those schools could still continue to teach what they're teaching without having to shift all their curriculum to suddenly fall in line with what the public schools are teaching. And so that's a big deal for school choice program going forward.
Yes, that is good to know. Again, First Liberty, just a record-breaking work, amazing work at the Supreme Court. This is just one of the many cases that you have won that have set great precedents for Americans of faith everywhere. But before I go over just a few changes that might happen with higher education. If parents have been listening and they are interested in knowing more about their religious liberty rights in the school system, they can actually get involved with F3 initiative, which you lead. So tell us how they can get involved with that.
Yeah, F3 stands for the Future of Faith and Freedom, and we know that it's the young parents right now that are going to continue this movement forward of knowing what our rights are. And that case that we talked about, My Shadow is Pink, that came from a home event that we did in Southern California where one of our ambassadors, which are our community leaders, heard what was happening to this family, brought them to an event, and then we were able to talk and then help them out. But we're looking for people all across the country that want to know more about their rights, want to help bring others in, and then support the mission of what we're doing. And the leaders of that are ambassadors who say, hey, I want to bring this to my community. I want this to be a thing where I'm at, and I want to be on the watch in my community for making sure that we're standing up for our rights. So if you're interested in that, you can go to firstliberty.org/F3. There's a whole lot of information on there. And then those people that want to take that leadership step, we have that ambassador program.
Great. So many ways to get involved and take action and make a difference and be able to stand up for your constitutional rights. But I did want to draw your attention to another article that's on pointofview.net where you can follow along with everything we're discussing. But this one is from the American Enterprise Institute because Trump has also floated a lot of ideas about ways to reform higher education. And this is relevant too because a lot of people are unsatisfied with higher education. And there is another report that just came out showing that Americans are, often think that colleges are too liberal, that they are indoctrinating college students, they're brainwashing them. And then after many of the pro-Hamas demonstrations and protests we saw last year after October 7th, the public opinion of universities went down even more. So just, again, some of the things covered in that article from the American Enterprise Institute include accreditation reform. This would have to do with actually changing some of the methods and the ways that colleges receive accreditation, including the accreditors themselves who often maybe put pressure on universities to comply with certain, more left-leaning agendas or policies or implementing some things like that. They've talked about expanding the endowment tax on wealthy colleges, which would basically, in short terms, be taxing Harvard for the benefit of the working class, which a lot of people probably initially like the sound of that. But Trump has also talked about creating a national American university. So you can read more about that online. But Peyton, I'm not sure how I feel about the federal government getting involved in creating a university. What are your thoughts on that?
I'm exactly with you. I don't know how I feel about the federal government getting involved. I would lean more the direction of not wanting them involved with a particular university. But anyway, we'll just have to see what happens moving forward with all this with the higher education. It's close to my heart. It's kind of early to tell. I know Trump's appointments, they're still finding out who might be in what position. And so I think that will also determine kind of the outcome of some of these things, which, some of these could happen. Some of it could be speculation. But we're definitely moving that direction. But that's why there's checks and balances.
Yes, absolutely. So we can continue to pray that the next administration will be filled with wise people who can lead our country in a good direction. But don't go anywhere because we have a break. But when we come back, we'll be discussing how the mainstream media is actually experiencing some backlash, maybe a little bit overdue. We'll discuss that more when we come back after this.
It almost seems like we live in a different world from many people in positions of authority. They say men can be women and women men. People are prosecuted differently or not at all, depending on their politics. Criminals are more valued and rewarded than law-abiding citizens. It's so overwhelming, so demoralizing. You feel like giving up. But we can't. We shouldn't. We must not. As Winston Churchill said to Britain in the darkest days of World War II, never give in, never give in, never, 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 never yield to force, never yield to the apparently overwhelming might of the enemy. And that's what we say to you today. This is not a time to give in, but to step up and join Point of View in providing clarity in the chaos. We can't do it alone, but together, with God's help, we will overcome the darkness. Invest in biblical clarity today at pointofview.net or call 1-800-347-5151. Pointofview.net and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
I just wanted to tell you, too, how much I have appreciated Point of View over the years. I've always been taught that we take care of our own, and I feel like Point of View is one of our own because of the Christian worldview that you do promote. And so I have become a partner today, and I just want to thank you so much, and just God bless you for all that you do.
Listen, I wanted to make a quick comment. I'm a relatively new listener to the show, and I really kind of stumbled upon it more than anything because I'm doing some driving now that I wasn't in the past. And my comment really is, I think you guys and gals are more right on about the assessment of this country right now than anything I've heard. You know, I go home and I tell my wife, you've got to hear what they're talking about on the show. It's just so right on. And I tell my parents the same thing.
I'm 25 years old, and I started listening to Point of View about 4 years ago, and it has changed the way that I think and the way that I view the world around me.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kirby Anderson. Each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, your guest host for Point of View.
Welcome back to Point of View's Weekend Edition. I'm Liberty McArtor, sitting in for Kirby Anderson today. And I have with me around the round table Peyton Luke, media specialist with First Liberty Institute and the producer of First Liberty Live, and Nathan Shackelford, who is Associate General Counsel with First Liberty and leader of the F3 Initiative. We have been covering a lot of topics so far, a lot of them related to education, some cases that you guys are fighting for religious freedom and education, and what we might look at in the future in that regard with the Trump administration. But let's talk about the media a little bit. If some of you may have heard, especially if you're listening online, Penna Dexter's commentary, but you can also find that this weekend at pointofview.net. And she talks about how the media has been rebuked. So if you're listening to Point of View, then you've known for a long time that there is bias in the mainstream media. This is not a secret, but I think that the mainstream media, the legacy media, outlets like the New York Times, the Washington Post, CNN, ABC, etc., I think they're getting a little bit of self-awareness because the numbers aren't lying. For instance, cable news coverage used to hold a lot of sway with voters in just, the manner of their coverage and who they covered leading up to a presidential election, really impacting the outcome. But not as much influence anymore. And we'll talk a little bit more about how different media outlets impacted the election here in a few minutes. But Peyton, as someone like me with a background educationally in journalism and media, and of course you work as the media specialist for First Liberty now, are you surprised that the legacy media, the mainstream media, is losing trust with Americans?
No, because it's not starting now. It's been going on for the last several years, and the American people are over it. So, my background was convergence journalism. That was my undergraduate degree. Most people would ask, what is that? And so it's the combination of all the different mediums and forms of media, whether that's print, radio, TV, now social media, web, all of the above. And we used to talk about this as students and even with our professors because the atmosphere was just changing so rapidly for our generation and how people got the news and how people shared the news, as well as just conversations in general. So I think part of the issue is that a lot of the media wants clicks. And so they do these stories that get attention. They're going to do stuff that's based on crime and taps into people's fear. They're going to...
If it bleeds, it leads.
That's exactly... I literally have that written in my notes.
We both learned that.
Oh, absolutely. If it bleeds, it leads. That is a quote that literally journalist students are taught because it gets people fired up and they're going to read it. It gets views. It gets clicks. But the American people want substance and they want trusted sources. We're tired of lies, and we're just tired of not having that certain substance. Also, the difference in how our generation has worked is it's all of these. It's everyone has a phone. Everyone is a journalist. We talked about this all the time because of prolific social media. So anyone on the street with a phone, with a camera is now suddenly a journalist. And some of those social media influencers have a bigger following than even some of the news sites and even some of the news outlets. So, but at the end of the day, they might not be trained journalists. They might not be checking their sources. They might not be doing credible sources or interviewing people that really have the background, and people nowadays don't double check those. As journalists, you're taught to do that. However, I'm not saying that everyone in media nowadays does that. It feels like even a lot of the big outlets aren't checking their sources, or they're just doing stuff that they know will be clickbait and jumping on the air, going live and saying stuff before they've had time to double check it. So I think that's why people are now tired of it, or that they transition to someone that they know that they can trust, even if it's not a journalist, it's not a news outlet. Say it's someone who has their doctorate degree in something, or someone who just feels relatable and has a good heart that seems so transparent, and then they present the articles, or don't, it kind of like Nathan said earlier, they don't tell you what to think, they teach you how to think, and they give you the proper sources. So there's a lot here, and I'm excited to continue to unpack this in this hour.
Yes. It is such an important topic. And might I just say, thank you for listening to Point of View. For those of you listening, because our goal is to be a place where you can receive trustworthy, thoughtful news. And Point of View, I grew up listening to Point of View, and it's been on for over 50 years. So if you're a new listener, this is, a long time program. So
this is a good source. This is a good source.
Well, it is needed in our culture. And I will say that Kirby has actually written a booklet on media bias that really demonstrates, this is something we've covered multiple times in Outlook Magazine and on the air, but, there are reasons for media bias. And I think what you were saying, Peyton, is like initially, especially those of us who have studied journalism, we're kind of reacting like, oh my goodness, if everybody's a journalist, then, it's not as trustworthy. They're not checking their facts. And a lot of times that is true. And you have to be careful with what you see online. But we're also seeing a lack of fact checking sometimes, even in the mainstream, where people are supposed to be able to trust what they're reading or what they're seeing. And so some of the reason for that is just because of bias among journalists. I don't have all of the exact numbers in front of me, but a lot of it's not malicious. It is, people are blind in certain areas. And so if you look at who is a journalist working at a lot of these mainstream or traditional outlets, they are usually these offices and outlets are located on the coast. The journalists that work for them are usually from the same area around there. And the majority, it's like the vast majority, if you poll reporters, are voting Democrat. Very few vote Republican. And so a lot of times it's not even a malicious intent to misrepresent the news or to be biased in reporting. It's simply that it's an echo chamber. And I think people are reacting to that. And Nathan, as somebody who works with a lot of clients at First Liberty, I assume that you deal with real average Americans who probably don't feel like they are being represented in the mainstream media very well.
Yeah, I think a big shift that's happened too is with kind of like we've been talking about is the rise of technology and what that's mean of how people receive news and where they get that. I've seen all kinds of studies that people trust more about what they see online even than on TV or radio or print. They're going to trust kind of that more online medium more. And that's a lot of it's because of accessibility to our phones. A lot of people in their workday don't have a TV in their office and have the news pulled up. And when they're going home, if they're turning on TV, they're not turning on news. They're turning on Netflix or whatever. They're not coming home to get the news.
That's true.
A lot of my friends, at least that are in my demographic, use when they're on their commute to work, they're listening to podcasts and they're listening to, or they're turning on radio, do something like that. But they're using that as kind of their, hey, I'm going to get my educational time on my way to work. And then I'm going to be working, then I'm going to go home and unwind. And so I think that different medium has led to a shift in that. Plus, a lot of these, if we're talking TV especially, a lot of the main media sources, they're all older. They're not younger. So
very true. Yes. So we will continue discussing the backlash to media bias when we come back after these short messages.
This is Viewpoints with Kirby Anderson.
Ned Ryan begins his article with these questions. What if I told you that the President of the United States doesn't really run our government? Or that people in Washington, D.C. don't really believe in representative democracy? Or that a government of, by, and for the people is just an illusion? His article and his book, American Leviathan, The Birth of an Administrative State and Progressive Authoritarianism, explains that we have moved from a republic to an un-American administrative state. He calls it a slow regime change or a gradual coup that is undermining our Constitution and our constitutional republic. It has undercut the original intent of the Constitution. It has eroded our freedoms. It has undermined our civil liberties. Back to his original questions, the administrative state calls into question who is governing our country. We have seen this in the last few years of the Biden administration. So many of us wondered who was making the important decisions, since it seemed obvious to most of us that the president wasn't up to the task mentally. Ned Ryan provides the history that goes back to the progressive movement led by Woodrow Wilson. The goal was to build a massive bureaucracy filled with unelected bureaucrats who were separated from political accountability. These elites would govern our country. They rejected the idea of a rights-based government because it was too limited in size and scope. That is why we have a sprawling federal bureaucracy. He argues that the president and Congress needs to break apart the administrative state and return legislative powers back to the Article I branch of government. To put it simply, it is time to drain the swamp. If this happens, we need more than slogans, we need action. I'm Kirby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free booklet on biblical reliability, go to viewpoints.info/biblical reliability. Viewpoints.info/biblical reliability. You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Welcome back to Point of View. I'm Liberty McArtor sitting in for Kirby Anderson today. We're talking about the backlash to the mainstream media. Penna Dexter covered this in her weekend commentary. And we also have an article that you'll want to read posted at pointofview.net. It's from the Wall Street Journal. Trump's win cemented it. New media is leaving the old guard behind. So we've been talking about how this really long-term problem of bias in the media is getting, maybe the attention that it deserves among some in the media. For instance, I'll mention that the Washington Post decided not to endorse a political candidate before the presidential election. A presidential candidate, And this was actually a very controversial decision for them. Multiple journalists that work for them resigned in protest, which just goes to show you how biased many of these traditional outlets have become, that the fact that they would endorse a presidential candidate was taken for granted that they would. I personally don't think newspapers should endorse a presidential candidate. Ideally, I would like for them to report fairly and then people can make their own decision. But the landscape is definitely changing. A lot of people aren't getting their news from the traditional sources anymore. So, Peyton, I know you have some research that you've looked up from the Pew Research Center on who is getting their news where.
Sure. So, yes, according to the Pew Research Center, a large majority of U.S. adults, 86%, say that they at least sometimes get news from a smartphone, computer, or tablet. This is what Nathan was saying earlier, including 57% who say they do so often. And this is also interesting because if you go to the next quote that I had underlined somewhere, I'm looking for it right here. Here it is. When asked which of these platforms they prefer to get news on, 58% Americans say they prefer a digital device, far higher than the share who prefer TV, which is 32%. Relatively few Americans have print at 4%.
And yes, another thing that Pew reported is that over half, 54% of Americans get their news on social media. Yeah. So this does concern me because we also know that there are algorithms at play on different social media platforms. I was reading in this article that we have posted from the Wall Street Journal that Facebook and Google have backed off of that some, but I do think that it's still a problem, especially on things like TikTok and Instagram. They're going to show you more of what you already watch. So if you are in a particular echo chamber, whether it's a very left-leaning echo chamber or a very right-leaning echo chamber, due to the algorithms on social media where you're getting your news, you're going to get further and further and further into those. But that's where people are getting their news. And Trump really tapped into that, didn't he, Nathan? And I think that's part of why we saw him win so decisively, because he took advantage of this new media in a way that I don't think any other presidential candidate ever has before.
Yeah, if you listen to some of the post-election media coverage, I heard a segment by MSNBC where they said that Kamala ran a perfect race, essentially, from a strategy standpoint, because she had all of the biggest celebrities coming out for, and like they were naming all these people that those people never come out and endorse anyone, but naming all these celebrities. And then you contrast that with Trump and what he was doing by going on Joe Rogan and being on these different podcasts. And I think it was a very different strategy of relatability, really, of how do we find people where they already are right now. People might like Taylor Swift and watch her, but are they really seeing her as someone that's relatable to them? Probably not. Whereas a lot of men listen to the Joe Rogan podcast, and it's the top in the world for a reason, and people see him as relatable. So if you're getting to those places where people are watching where they can relate to the person, I think that's the new way that things are shifting is that relatability.
Yeah, I think you're right. And again, I mean, Harris did go on a couple of podcasts, I believe, but Trump went on about 20 podcasts. So, and that's a lot. That's tens of millions of listeners right there. With, like, just for instance, where it was in this article on that we posted on pointofview.net from the Wall Street Journal that Trump sat down with Joe Rogan for 3 hours. And that interview had 45 million views on YouTube and over 25 million listens across Spotify. And then he was on, like you said, several other high-profile podcasts as well, which is where a lot of the young men are getting their news and information now. And so while he may not have changed many minds, though I think he did change some minds probably by coming on those podcasts, what I think he likely did and how this impacted the turnout is that he motivated a bloc that wasn't as likely to go to the polls, which is young men. They weren't traditionally as likely to vote. But he motivated them by going on those podcasts. He reached out, and I will say I read from a different report that it was actually his son, Barron Trump, who said, "Hey, Dad, you've got to get on these podcasts," which, again, that he had his finger on the pulse of where young people are getting their news today. But it certainly is changing, and there are multiple ramifications of the changing media landscape, aren't there, Peyton, in terms of the echo chambers, the divides, and the reliability of the news that we get?
There really are. In fact, I was talking to two friends just this week that are on very different sides of the aisle. And they were having discussions on some of the viewpoints. And one side was saying, I haven't heard anything from Christians based on the election or actually being kind to our side or explaining how they're going to work with us and making those kinds of comments. She's like, I have not seen anything. And then I have another friend that's like, that's on the contrary for me. Like, that's mainly what I've been seeing. I've been seeing people reaching out. I've been seeing the conservative Christians speak up and have conversations and how we need to love our neighbor and work together. And so the discussion actually came up of algorithms, because at the end of the day, if we're only on social media, if we're only on Instagram, if we're only on Facebook, if we're only on TikTok, you're not going to see that. You're not going out and looking for it. And so I think especially a lot of young Americans are not doing their research on particular topics and going between the different outlets. I know my boss at First Liberty, he's the director of media relations, and he has the tabs open of all the different media outlets, anywhere from MSNBC to Fox to The Hill to all the different ranges, because you want to see what other groups are reporting so you don't get within those echo chambers. And I do want to say a quick thing on Trump going on Joe Rogan and all too. I think it made Kamala look less qualified as well to a degree, because she was asked to go on Joe Rogan too, so they could have equality there. And her team told them, we can only do 45 minutes. Then it was lifted up to an hour, but then Joe Rogan was told he would have to go to Kamala, and then her team shut it down and said no. So she wouldn't do the length, and she wouldn't do the format, which is how everyone else does that particular show. So it was very interesting to see how she approached the situation in comparison to Trump, who was able to just roll with it and really talk to the everyday American people. And like you said, Liberty, get people to the polls.
Yeah, I think it does. Again, that's an example of an echo chamber within kind of the liberal media, is thinking that, reaching out to some of those unconventional or newer kind of outlets wouldn't matter as much. But I did want to highlight this quote from the end of the article that we have posted from the Wall Street Journal. The fragmenting of the media world means that people are processing the same news, a presidential debate, a supposed gaffe on the campaign trail, very differently, depending on where they are getting the information. People tend to live in their own media echo chambers now more than ever, which we've talked about. So, again, it's something to be aware of, to understand how the people around us are getting their news, and also to extend grace, because something that may seem so obvious to us based on the news that we've seen, or what our For You page on Instagram is showing us, is going to be completely different for somebody else. And it does seem like sometimes we're living in two different realities. So, Peyton, I loved what you said about just making sure. Kirby often says, I read CNN and MSNBC, so you don't have to. But the principle there is, yes, read the news widely. Listen to sources that you agree with, for sure, but also listen to sources that you disagree with, because there's going to be some bias there, which you have to listen, but they may be reporting on a fact that your own side was blind to. And so, again, you have to weigh everything against the Word of God, but look at the whole picture. Try to find those trustworthy sources of news who are doing their research and checking their facts, and make sure that you are getting a full picture with the media. But we're going to be talking about some of the ramifications of those echo chambers, especially after the election. We are seeing a lot of division right now, and coming up on the holidays, we did want to address this topic because a lot of you may be having difficult conversations with friends. Peyton mentioned she has friends with very different beliefs, with family members even, in a couple of weeks when you gather for Thanksgiving. So we're going to be talking about what that landscape looks like right now in America and how we can respond as Christians. So this is the weekend edition of Point of View. Don't go anywhere. We'll be back after this short break.
Many years ago, they began saying that we live in the information age. Well, today there is so much information coming at us from every direction. The hardest thing is to discern which issues are really important, and how can I make a positive impact without wasting my time trying to figure out accurate information. Let me give you a suggestion to help with that. Visit pointofview.net. Look at the tabs across the top. Find the one named Viewpoints. Kirby Anderson and others on our team are constantly watching for news to identify those issues that you really need to know about. They boil things down in a brief summary, and then you can decide if it's something on which you want to learn more and get involved. Again, when you go to pointofview.net, click on Viewpoints, you'll see exactly what I mean. You'll see the issues that we are covering right now. And when you like what you see, I honestly think you will, you can slide on over, enter your email, and get them automatically sent to your inbox each day. That's it. Take a minute now, be informed. Pointofview.net, click on Viewpoints. Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, your guest host for Point of View.
Welcome back to Point of View. I'm Liberty McArtor in studio today with Peyton Luke and Nathan Shackelford, both from First Liberty, around the roundtable. We've been having a great discussion, and we were just talking about the echo chambers that are created, especially now with the current media landscape. And what we're really seeing is a lack of people able to engage in critical thinking, right, Nathan?
Yeah, I think it goes back to what we talked about in the first segment with education of people know what to think. They're not taught how to think, but kind of what to think. And you see that play into how people view things politically and how they are, and in conversations of people that have disagreeing views is people don't know how to think for things themselves. So even if people are getting all their news from one source, you should still be able to look at that and say, okay, this person generally agrees with me, but you still should be able to look at every issue they're presenting and say, well, maybe I disagree with you on this issue. I agree with you on most things, but I'm going to critically look at this and not just accept everything coming from Fox News or everything coming from this one podcaster as something I believe myself too. You need to be able to have these arguments and be able to see both sides and really be able to think for yourself, which I think a lot of people right now just want you to accept everything they put out as true, which is what we saw during the election. But I think people are really trying to have more of these conversations now. So hopefully we can get back to a place where we can have debates that are less emotional and really just talk about facts and go back and forth and really evaluate things more logically.
I hope so too. I mean, that really is the foundation of our nation. Oftentimes the founding fathers are lumped together, but they debated fiercely about multiple issues, including how our Constitution would be formed, whether we needed the Constitution. And we have definitely lost, many of us anyway, have lost that ability to debate in society. And we're seeing an example of this after the election. So Peyton, tell us about this article that came out from Fox. We have it posted on pointofview.net, but it's really sad what a lot of people, the measures that they are taking against those who disagree with them.
Yeah, this is just so sad. So the headline reads, Yale psychiatrist calls it, quote, essential for liberals to cut off Trump voting loved ones during the holidays. So Yale University chief psychiatry resident Dr. Amanda Calhoun spoke to MSNBC host Joy Reid on this past Friday, about ways liberals who are devastated with Trump's re-election this week can cope with news, including separating from certain loved ones. And this just breaks my heart because, at the end of the day, we're not going to solve anything by avoidance. As y'all were saying, it's all about healthy discussion or even healthy debate. But at the end of the day, your identity is not in politics. It's not in a political figure. So why would you choose to distance yourself and not go to holidays and separate yourself from people who have loved you for years based on one election and one thing of political opinion or outcome? And so this just breaks my heart, because if people were more willing to go in, have those discussions, if the opportunity arose, hear both sides and have empathy and be human and just have those discussions. But just because you disagree doesn't mean like you need to attack the person or distance yourself completely. One of my friends was talking just earlier today, and she heard someone say online on social media, they're like, oh yeah, I've already blocked my dad on my phone because they voted differently. And that just breaks my heart, to shut down entire relationships for years based on a political outcome.
Yeah. And, I think we do have to look at this in the broader context of the last few years. And just as to Nathan's point, the lack of critical thought, because we have moved. Again, this goes back to kind of the ideology of critical theory, where if you don't agree with me, then you are evil. And we saw this movement at universities. Speaking of distrust in universities and Ivy League education, this is an example with kind of the stuff that people are hearing from higher ups at places like Yale. A lot of Americans, that they know that that's not right and that doesn't resonate with them. But anyways, we're told that words are violence. And so I can't handle, this is what, many people have been raised to believe, is I can't handle hearing an idea that is different than mine. Because if you don't agree with me on X, Y, and Z, that means that you are evil, that I am actually unsafe. So I don't want to minimize concerns of actual, prejudice or issues or conflicts, because of course those happen in America. It's not a perfect nation by any means. And so we do want to take those seriously, but more of the broader issue of you saw this election differently than I did. And therefore now I cannot communicate with you. America can't go on like this. We were made to be a pluralist society. And I think that actually a lot of the work that you do at First Liberty, Nathan, contributes to that, because it's saying, let's get back to our roots of we don't have to all agree, but we all need to have that freedom to express that deep part of ourselves.
Yeah, I think when you look back at the founding of the country, the biggest thing that brought everyone together was the freedom of religion. They were trying to get away from Church of England, what was going on in England, and wanting to have these differences of religious thought. And there's a quote, I can't remember who it's by, but that one of our founders that basically just says that without religion, everything, the whole structure falls apart, essentially, because we were founded as a Christian nation. And if we at the root, we're seeing that now, if at the root of everything, if we can't agree on our faith, if we can't agree on a basic faith background, then other things are going to start taking that place. And I think what we're seeing right now is some people are having politics become the new, almost like a faith structure, where all their hope is in who's the president, who's in charge, versus, hey, we might disagree on a lot of these things, but at the end of the day, if we can come back to our faith, if we can come back to what is the most important thing in our lives. But I think we've lost that faith as a nation, and can't be considered a overtly Christian nation now. A lot of people would consider the decline in Christianity in our country today and the rise in atheism, I think, causes a lot of the things we're seeing today.
Yes, I agree. And this is why having a biblical worldview is so important, because when we are looking at a situation like this from a biblical perspective, and by the way, even we've talked about this on Point of View too, but even among people who self-identify as Christians, the percentage of adults in America who actually have a biblical worldview in terms of agreeing with kind of the basic tenets of Christianity, it's a very small percentage. And so if as believers, we need to be making sure that we are looking through things with a biblical lens, not giving in just to our media echo chambers, but saying, okay, guess what? We live in a fallen world. We are all different. We are all made in the image of God, but we are all different. We are all fallen. We're all going to make mistakes. We're going to make misjudgments and miscalculations. But this is a person that is loved and made in the image of God. Therefore, I love them. I treat them with dignity and respect, and I can still engage with them and love that person even if they have a vastly different opinion from me. But like you were saying, if politics is God, if that is at the end all be all for you and that is the source of your hope, then it makes sense that there really is kind of just this hopelessness if your side doesn't win, and we have to make sure that we don't fall into that.
Yeah, I actually had someone who commented on a post that I made post-election, and she said, Peyton, that's great if you're secure in your heavenly position. And that just broke my heart, because that is just, she doesn't have that hope. It truly only is in the political outcome and things of this earth. And at the end of the day, as Christians, we know we are citizens of heaven. We are going to be involved in politics. We're going to vote. We're going to do our citizen duty. But at the end of the day, we have such hope and such freedom knowing that our identity isn't in politics. It is in Christ. It is in Jesus. And that is a beautiful thing. And so I just hope all of us can continue to express it that way over the holidays. Be kind, have empathy, share love, and have open discussion, so that way people can come to know the love of Jesus and potentially also see different points of view.
Yes, such wise words. So we're about to go to one of those breaks, but stay with us because we have one last segment, and we will be highlighting an article published in Christianity Today that I really like it because it takes us through multiple points of Scripture and how we can practically apply these biblical eternal truths to this the situation, the environment that we're in. And I'll also just plug Know Why Podcast. You can go to knowwhypodcast.com. It's an affiliate ministry with Point of View. And I'm the host of Know Why Podcast. And our goal is to talk about current and relevant issues like this, specifically for a younger audience. So if you have friends or relatives who are Gen Z and they want to engage in a little bit shorter, 20 to 30 minutes, compelling discussions, thoughtful discussions about these kinds of issues, send them to the podcast, knowwhypodcast.com. But we're on the Point of View Weekend Edition, and we'll be right back after this short break.
It's been a long time since conservatives expected fair and balanced coverage of elections by the legacy media. But the left counts on traditional news outlets to tip the scales with favorable coverage of its candidates and issues. True to form, major outlets like the New York Times, the Washington Post, CNN, NBC, ABC, and CBS covered the 2024 campaigns and handled debates and interviews in the biased way they always do. But in this election, the media's failure to provide truthful and fair coverage hurt the left. Wall Street Journal columnist Kimberly Strassel writes, "So long as the left is pointing fingers, let it direct a big fat digit at the outfit that played the biggest role in losing at the election, the U.S. media. We cannot place the media in one overarching category. The Journal itself is legacy media, but its editorial page skews right. Today, Americans have numerous media outlets to choose from, and so do candidates. Even the Washington Post points out that Trump and his surrogates saw incredible value in tapping into a podcast ecosystem that has large numbers of young male listeners who otherwise might have skipped casting ballot. Meanwhile, much of the media ignored and expected voters to ignore border chaos, higher prices, and especially President Biden's decline. As Kim Strassel points out, in a world with a competent press, Mr. Biden's failing constitution would have been front-page news. Instead, the legacy media cooperated with the Democrats in covering it up. If they had done a better job reporting on it, there would have been time to hold a primary, which would have produced a tested nominee. Big shock, Americans didn't buy narratives like, "We're experiencing one of the strongest economies ever," or "Crime is falling." First Amendment freedoms include the press, because the press is meant to provide politicians with gut checks as to how their policies sit with the nation. Traditional news outlets face a reckoning. For Point of View, I'm Penna Dexter.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Welcome back to Point of View. We are about to wrap up the weekend edition, but we have a few more minutes left, so please stay with us. It has been a great conversation so far with Peyton Luke and Nathan Shackelford, both from First Liberty Institute, and we've discussed lots today. If you missed any of it, go to pointofview.net and read the articles that we have posted there as resources for you, free resources to take advantage of. But I did want to keep talking about this for just a moment. Peyton, you were telling us about a recent interview that was in the media where there was a Yale psychiatrist telling people to cut off loved ones who voted for Trump. And this is just an example of the bigger issue that we're seeing. A lot of you who are listening have probably experienced this. Arguments and fights with loved ones or people that used to be friends. And you have seen, maybe it turns out that you have seen some things differently. I think a lot of people are probably experiencing this after this election in particular, because you had a lot of people who voted differently than they have in the past. We've even seen this within the church, sadly, where there have been big divisions and attacks, Christians, brothers and sisters in Christ who are just very hostile with each other or saying they're not real Christians, because they voted this way. And you can have your disagreements and again, those healthy debates, but just some of the hostility that we're seeing is troubling. But how do we respond as Christians? I wanted to highlight this article. It's by Bonnie Christian from Christianity Today. And I encourage you to read it it's at pointofview.net. And she takes us through multiple scriptures, multiple verses that are so applicable right now. I'll just go through and hit a few of them. These are things that are timeless for us, and it doesn't depend on how we voted or who won the election. Obey the king's command. Obey our leader's command. We are told to respect our government authorities in Scripture. However, our ultimate obedience is to the Lord. So stand up, for truth, stand up for what is right. And so we need to make sure that even if our side won, who we voted for won, that we are thinking for ourselves, like Nathan said earlier, not just going along because it's our party or it's who we voted for, and to keep God first. But we also don't want to get caught up in fear or worry because nobody knows the future. We've been talking a lot about the potential changes that might come in the next administration, but no one knows what's going to happen. So all we can do is really trust the Lord, be secure in Him, keep on loving one another as brothers and sisters. And this is so important. And I thought she made a really good point because in the book of Hebrews in the Bible, we are told to have hospitality to strangers, remember those in prison, those who were mistreated. And this was written to a group of people who were poor, they were powerless in their society, and yet they still had a duty to the stranger, the prisoner, and the suffering. So how much more do we have a responsibility? And so we can't lose sight of that, no matter what's happening in politics. And then we have to reject the idols of our society. Now, as it was then, sexual immorality and money, those are big idols in our society. We have to make sure that we are making sure we're not giving over to those and just keeping God's truth above all else. But anyways, there are more points that she makes in the article. I wanted to highlight it because I do think it gives us kind of a roadmap as believers, regardless of how you feel about the election results, what the outcome was. It gives us some pointers to just remember to have grace and continue to do what we were called to do as Christians. But Peyton, I want to know if there's anything that stuck out to you in particular from this advice. Yeah, I love this. Kind of as we were saying earlier, identity is not in politics, and there is hope, especially as citizens of heaven. And the verse that I want to highlight is Romans 12, particularly 9 through 16. I'm not going to take time to read all of it on the air, but I encourage you to read it leading up to the holiday season. And just to summarize, love must be sincere, be devoted to one another in love, honor one another above yourself, be joyful in hope, patient in affliction, faithful in prayer, share with the Lord's people who are in need, and practice hospitality, especially coming up with the holidays. Bless those who persecute you, bless and do not curse. Rejoice with those who rejoice, mourn with those who mourn, live in harmony with one another. Yes, so good. And Nathan, I think you mentioned something over one of the breaks. It was actually really practical in terms like if you are a little bit nervous because maybe you have a relationship and you have different views on things, we've lost the art of debate. But an exercise that we can take is to actually truly try to defend the opposite position from ours to make sure that we understand it. So tell us more about, how you think we should approach these kinds of conversations. Yeah, I think a lot of times we lose track of there's another side of this or there's another logical way. I think a lot of times we're taught, we think, our way is the right way and there's no other logical way to come about this. But if you take a second and you think, okay, in this situation, let's say I'm not, like we were talking about earlier, let's say I'm not a Christian. That would
that could totally impact the way we see the election, the way we see things. If this person thinks there is no God, then this could be traumatic. And so just thinking about where is this other person coming from, what views do they have, and showing love to those people in those conversations, understanding that that other people might have different ways of coming to their ideas and different backgrounds that form their ideas.
Yes, absolutely. So it is coming up on a holiday season, as we've said. So maybe challenge yourself and, be intentional about going to those family gatherings or those gatherings of friends, even if you're going to have some people there you disagree with. And, you don't have to talk about politics at the Thanksgiving dinner table. In fact, maybe it's wise not to, but you also don't have to be afraid of the conversation because it could lead you to some opportunities to really connect with somebody on a deeper level. So I do want to just bring one more thing to your attention, though. We've been talking about so much today about potential changes coming up with the administration regarding education. We've been talking about the changing media landscape. And while we have Nathan here from First Liberty, switching gears a little bit, tell us what are some other changes that we can be anticipating or looking for that may potentially happen starting in January.
Yeah, one of the biggest things for people to realize is that now that President Trump will have the presidency and the Senate, there's going to be an open window for about 2 years to nominate really good judges. We saw this during his first administration, where he put in hundreds of federal judges, multiple Supreme Court judges. And you might say, well, how does this make a difference for me today? Well, if we have judges that are going to follow the law is written to protect people of faith in this country. And if you have judges that will uphold the laws it's written, it not only protects us, but our kids and our grandkids for years to come. If a federal judge is put on the bench and this judge is in their 30s, 40s, 50s, they're going to be on the bench for the rest of their life. So President Trump is going to have the ability to nominate probably about 150 to 175 federal judges and anywhere from 1 to 3 Supreme Court judges. And what this means is that we could have a lot more religious freedoms that could come from this. The stage will be set for us to take back those rights if we have those judges in place. So it's a really encouraging time as a person of faith in the country to know that we have a really bright future for our rights as people of faith in this country.
Yes. And so, again, something to be praying for, too, that as the leaders make those appointments, that they are guided by wisdom and are able to make appointments that will truly benefit all Americans. And so I'm so thankful for the work that both of you do at First Liberty. Nathan, tell us a little bit more about what you do and where people can find information about you.
Yeah. So if you go to firstliberty.org, you'll see all of our information about what we do. I forgot to mention a second ago, we have the largest judicial vetting division in the country, so we'll be doing a lot of that research for these judges. We also have, if you're in your 20s to 40s or have kids or grandkids in your 20s to 40s, we have an initiative for those in their 20s to 40s that want to know more about their rights. And that's firstliberty.org/F3 or our F3 initiative. And then we have resources for everyone in every stage of life, from churches, parents, everything you can need. And if you're ever in a situation where you need legal help, you can always reach out to us on the Get Legal Help, and that's completely free. We don't charge for that. We just want to make sure faith is protected in this country.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, Peyton and Nathan, for being on Point of View today. Thank you for listening to Point of View. Kirby will be back in studio on Monday. Have a great weekend.
It almost seems like we live in a different world from many people in positions of authority. They say men can be women and women men. People are prosecuted differently or not at all, depending on their politics. Criminals are more valued and rewarded than law-abiding citizens. It's so overwhelming, so demoralizing. You feel like giving up, but we can't. We shouldn't. We must not. As Winston Churchill said to Britain in the darkest days of World War II, never give in, never give in, never, 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 never yield to force, never yield to the apparently overwhelming might of the enemy. And that's what we say to you today. This is not a time to give in, but to step up and join Point of View in providing clarity in the chaos. We can't do it alone, but together, with God's help, we will overcome the darkness. Invest in biblical clarity today at pointofview.net or call 1-800-347-5151. Pointofview.net and 800-347-5151. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.